Shafiq Naz. I'm a publisher, editor, and sometime translator from French and English to Urdu. I would like to welcome you to this session on 1001 Nights. And we are very proud to have someone come all the way from France, and I'll be introducing her to you a little later on. When I come from Lahore. When I was studying in my middle school, we used to have a wonderful headmaster who was supposed to be teaching us English. So for the first 40 minutes, he would teach us English, syntax, essay writing, and so on. But for the next 20 minutes, he would tell us stories, and wonderful stories. And I'm talking about when I was maybe 10, 11 years old. He would talk about the adventures of Amir Hamza, Hatim Tai, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Hamlet, and so on. But there were two particular stories which we loved immensely, because these stories took us to a magic world of jinns and golden palaces and a whole new set of things. And we loved to go to that period and attend that period, particularly for the stories and less for the added stuff, English and so on. But at that time, and the stories, of course, were Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, and Ali Baba and 40 Thieves. And we didn't know at that time, and very few people know, that actually these stories, with some of the other stories of 1001 Nights, are also the masterpieces of French literature of the 18th century, of French literature. How it came about, we are going to talk about all those things. There are two people we need to mention. One is Antoine Galland, who was the first translator of all these stories into French. And actually, it started from French, then it got translated into English, and then all the other languages, German, Italian, and so on. And he had already published about 8 volumes, and then he had finished. He had exhausted all the stuff which he had brought from his travels, and we'll be talking about that later on as well. But then he got lucky. He met a young man of 20 years old from Syria, who came to France, and he told them some other stories. And these two stories, that is Ali Baba and Aladdin, actually also one of those stories. These are called orphan stories, and we'll explain what that is. So as I mentioned, that we are very lucky to have Yasmine Seale. Yasmine Seale is the first woman translator of 1001 Nights, which is amazing because there have been many, many translations, but she's the first one. And as sometimes they call the first beardless person to translate 1001 Nights. Yasmine is a poet, a visual artist, and a translator from French and Arabic because he's of Syrian and French origin. And her book, her translation of Aladdin, came out in 2018 with rave reviews from different publications and so on. And then 2020, she got an award, which is Queen Mary Wasafiri New Writing Award, which is actually to support and to mentor young writers in different genres. And she got this award for a very nice poem, and I would recommend that you go on the internet and read it. It's available. It's called Conventional Wisdom. And it's really, what it does, it takes a saying in Arabic, which is something like, that the poetry is the divan of the Arabs. And then it just takes makes different lines on that sort of a theme, which is excellent. So I would recommend that you read it. And then because she has been entrusted with the formidable task of translating the whole of the 1001 Nights from Arabic as well as from French, and she's working on that. But in the meantime, she has also published a selection of stories called the Annotated Arabian Nights, which is an excellent publication, and I would again recommend that you can buy it from bookstore or even from Amazon, and they're also available on Kindle. And it's beautiful illustrations and photographs of different editions and adaptations and so on. And then she has also recently published a poetry, which is a sort of working on Ibn Arabi's poems, and it's called Agitated Air, if I believe, Agitated Air. So first of all, I would like you to really give a warm welcome to Yasmine Seale. So Yasmine, let me start from the very beginning. How did you, I know that you come from a family of writers, your great uncle was the Syrian national poet Nizar Kabani. How did you get into the Alf Laylah thing?
Hello, I think I'm clear. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be talking to you about 1001 Nights and to be in conversation with you, Shafiq. Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. Is that all right? As you mentioned, part of my family is Syrian and part of it is British, and I grew up in France. So I grew up surrounded by 3 languages and hearing a lot of poetry in those 3 languages and being aware almost before I could really speak, being aware that there was something magical about language and wanting to be part of that. So I've always been drawn to poetry in particular and to the possibility of communicating across languages. I think I've always been a translator, and those of us who live between languages, I think, know that translation is a part of everyday life as well as a literary activity. Alf Laylah is a project I did not choose myself. I did not choose and probably would not have chosen to embark on such an enormous task to translate one of the most influential works of world literature. It was a task that was entrusted to me that found me quite by accident when I was a graduate student looking for a way out of academia. I was approached by a publisher who had seen some of my translations of contemporary Arabic fiction and poetry, and who happened to be looking for someone to do a new translation of this work, of the Nights, which we'll talk a little bit about the history of translations of the Nights into English, but the translations that were available in English were either rather antiquated 19th century translations or more contemporary translations produced by academics that didn't exactly sing. So the publisher was looking for someone who was a contemporary poet, but who could also work with classical Arabic to give new life to these stories. So it was a happy accident.
So let's start from the beginning. What is the frame story, and what is the frame story of 1001 Nights?
The Nights, which in Arabic is called Alf Laylah wa-Laylah, and in English is sometimes known as the Arabian Nights, is a composite work that has been reinvented many times over the course of 1,000 years. It might be worth sketching out the history of this work. I'm sure you all have some relationship to this title or to these stories, but the history itself I find just as fascinating and surprising as the stories themselves. It's a work that comes into Arabic around the 9th century as a translation of an earlier Persian collection of stories, which is now lost to us, which was called Hazar Afsane, the 1,000 stories or the 1,000 legends. And that collection of stories incorporated material from South Asia, which again is inaccessible to us, or of which we only have traces. So the first textual evidence we have of this work is a very small fragment from the 9th century in Arabic, which was found in Egypt, which is a dialogue between 2 sisters, Shahrazad and Dunyazad. And this, remarkably, the earliest fragment to survive is a fragment which condenses the whole frame story, as you say. And what we mean by a frame story is a story that literally frames a collection of stories. So what we know as the Nights is not so much a text as a tradition of storytelling. There is no one text, which is also what makes it very difficult for the translator. There is no stable corpus from which to translate. There are many versions of many stories, but these stories are all held together by the framing story, which is a very famous one of Shahrazad and Shahriyar, which might be worth summarizing very briefly. It's the story of 2 kings, brothers, who discover that they have been betrayed by their wives and set out on a journey to discover whether anyone is more unhappy than they are. And after a series of adventures, they conclude that no woman can be trusted. And one of these kings, Shahryar, returns to his kingdom and decides to take a new wife every night and to have her killed in the morning so that he may never be betrayed again. He does this until there are almost no women left. And at this point, a young woman steps forward, Shahrazad, who is the daughter of the king's vizier, volunteers to marry the king and to end the massacre. She is a kind of superhero. She takes it upon herself she risks her own life in order to save her sisters. And she does this with an incredibly ingenious device, which is to start a story on the first night and to stop at the moment of greatest suspense so that the king, desperate to hear the rest, lets her live another day and does this indefinitely or for 1,001 nights until the king, by the end, has changed his ways and lets her live. So it's a work that is all about the power of storytelling, the power of language to keep the cruelties of powerful people in check. And this frame story, which is a very famous one, we think probably had a Persian or an Indian origin, and a small core of stories come into Arabic from that Persian collection. What then happened is that new stories were added in 9th and 10th century Iraq in Arabic, and the work continued to grow after that. And as Shafiq tantalizingly hinted at earlier, some of the stories that became the most popular and the most associated with the Knights were not added until the 18th century and were not published and were first published in French. But we can come back to that.
Exactly. So that's where now we talk about this Frenchman. His name is Antoine Galland, and he traveled to the Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean regions, Palestine, Syria, and so on. And he spent about 15 years in total during his 3 trips. But he was in love with Arabic literature. And he started collecting manuscripts. And that's how he came across manuscripts of Sinbad and some of the other stories. So talk us through how did this happen, and when he comes back, how did he start the process of translation?
The Knights, as I mentioned, had circulated in Arabic for some time, by the time Galland came across them. But the event that really launched the Knights onto the global stage, the event that really turned the Knights into a work of world literature, was Galland's translation. The stories to that point had circulated as stories for merchants. They were not considered to be particularly high literature. There are many great masterpieces of Arabic poetry and prose of that time, but the Knights were not really included among them. Galland, as you say, was a French antiquarian. He worked at the French embassy in Constantinople. He was very interested in coins. In fact, he expressed amazement and regret that his work on coins was not as popular as his translations of the Knights. He felt that his numismatics was his great contribution to knowledge. He comes across a Syrian manuscript produced in the 15th century, including about 30 stories, I think, and it breaks off in the middle of the last one. And he begins to translate them. And these stories, translated and published in French, launch the greatest publishing craze of the 18th century. This is a time in early 18th century France, the France of Louis XIV, which is becoming very interested in fairy tales, which is a nascent genre at the time. The main readers are aristocratic French women who are devouring these fairy tales. And when Galland's translations appear, they become an enormous success. He publishes 7 volumes of these stories from the manuscript that he's found. And then his publisher puts out an 8th volume, including stories by a rival Orientalist, which infuriates Galland, who has a falling out with his publisher. And at that point is in Paris and looking for new stories to feed the craze that he has created. And it is at that point in 1709 that he has the luck of meeting the young Syrian man that Shafiq mentioned, who is an extraordinary character, one of the most fascinating in the long history of this work. He is, as you say, very young. He's 20 years old, and he's from Aleppo. He's from a Maronite family. His name is Hanna Diab, and he tried being a monk, but ran away from the monastery, and happened to meet in Aleppo a French archaeologist named Paul Lucas, who was in the Levant trying to collect antiquities and curiosities to feed the royal library, but knew no languages, and recruits the young Diab to be his translator and his assistant on his journey around the Mediterranean in exchange for the promise of a job in Paris. The young Diab thinks that this sounds more exciting than a career as a monk and follows Lucas around the Mediterranean to France, all the way to Paris, where Hanna Diab is introduced to King Louis XIV and spends 3 years living in Paris. And it's in that time that he happens to meet Antoine Galland, and who asks him, "Do you know any stories? I need some more Arabic stories." And Diab tells him a number of stories over a number of spring nights in 1709. And it is these stories, Aladdin and Ali Baba among them, that become the most archetypal stories in the nights. For a long time, it was believed that Galland had simply made these stories up because no Arabic manuscript had been found for them. But now we know a lot more about Diab. Another incredible twist in this tale is that in the 1990s, Diab's autobiography was found. A manuscript of Diab's memoir was found in the Vatican Library, where it had lain undiscovered for many decades, having been brought from Aleppo to the Vatican by a Syrian cardinal. A French researcher, in fact, discovered this manuscript in the Vatican Library. It was translated into French and is now available in English as of last year. So we now know a lot more about Diab, and therefore about the circumstances in which these world-famous stories like Aladdin and Ali Baba came into being. So it's now possible to think of them as Franco-Arab collaborations rather than simply the inventions of the French Orientalist.
Antoine Galland was a fascinating man, as I mentioned. And while he was writing, he used to say that because a lot of his scholarly work was very important to him, and he used to work on that during the day. And in the evening, when there was less light, he would write these stories. And while he was translating Aladdin, and it's fascinating, during the day, he was translating Holy Quran, because he believed that the best way for Europeans to learn about Muslims and about their religion is through their basic text. But the unfortunate thing is that manuscripts had disappeared. But manuscripts have a way of emerging any time, so maybe one of these days we'll have that translation by Antoine Galland somewhere as well. So we mentioned Hanna Diab. Now tell me, the stories which Hanna Diab told, is it possible that he just invented them, that he was actually the teller of the stories? Or because we have no manuscript of those two stories, right?
This is the fascinating thing to me. No Arabic manuscript has been found for the story of Aladdin. All we have is one page in Galland's diary saying, "I met with Hanna this evening. He gave me the story of the wonderful lamp." And in fact, Galland's diary at this point breaks into a kind of shorthand, as if he was taking dictation as if Hanna was actually telling this story and Galland was sketching it out. Galland then expands this story, publishes it, but no Arabic text exists. So the question is, where did this story come from? Had Diab heard it in Aleppo? Had he made it up? Had he made it up on the basis of his adventures around the Mediterranean and in France? Aladdin, for a long time, was considered to be a kind of French fantasy of the East. There is a gorgeous palace. There are many motifs that we think of as typical of Orientalist literature. But what if this palace was in fact Diab's impression of Versailles? What if, in fact, Aladdin was a Syrian person's fantasy of France? And maybe it's both. Aladdin is the product of the mutual fascination of these two men, Galland, who was immersed in and fascinated by Arabic culture, and Diab, who had worked in the home of a Frenchman in Aleppo, knew Italian, even knew Provençal, and was equally expert in his French audience. And I think it may be both at the same time.
So what happened to him? I mean, I guess Paul Lucas took him because he had promised him that he would get him a job at the royal court. Yeah. But what happened to him?
The job never materializes. Diab spends 3 years waiting for this job he was promised at the Royal Library, and eventually, disappointed, returns to Aleppo, where he becomes a cloth merchant and spends the rest of his life selling cloth and, no doubt, telling stories of his incredible adventure in France. And at the end of his life, in his 70s, he writes this memoir, which is the manuscript I mentioned earlier, and died probably not knowing the impact that these stories he'd produced had had. He probably died not knowing the effect he'd had on world literature, because Galland never acknowledged him. Galland never credited him as his source. We know that it was Diab because of Galland's diary, but he never acknowledged it publicly.
Now, as you mentioned, the first volumes came in 1704, the first 2 volumes, and immediately afterward, the translation process started. So I think a couple of years afterward, we have the first Grub Street English translation, and then into German, Latin, and Dutch, and so on. So let's talk about the translations now, particularly English translations. How did they come about, and how do you evaluate them? Because there are a number of them from Edward Lane and so on. And how do you approach your translations compared with some of the other translations in English?
As you say, Galland's translation in turn became a kind of original text. It was Galland's translation that served as the basis for the future translations, all of the 18th century translations, into European languages and beyond. There are translations into Tamil and Japanese and Icelandic, which all use Galland's French text as the source. The first English translations were anonymous. They were the so-called Grub Street editions. They were cheap chapbooks. And it was at this point that this work began to be called the Arabian Nights, which is a sort of made-up English title for them. I prefer to call them the 1001 Nights. There are a number of famous 19th century translations of the Nights, which are still read today. You mentioned the translations of Edward Lane and of Richard Burton, which are both rather eccentric documents, each in their different ways. Lane was the son of a priest who, to escape a career in the church, immersed himself in Arabic and disappeared to Egypt and produced translations of not only the Nights but the Quran, and also produced an Arabic dictionary, which is still the only reliable historical dictionary of Arabic. So we still rely on Lane. But his translation of the Nights is full of redaction. He removed everything that he considered to be in bad taste. He removed all of the erotic content of the stories because his audience were Victorian families. So he, in line with the long tradition of the Nights, he shaped the text to suit the tastes of his audience. Richard Burton did the opposite. He added a lot of material that was not in the original, injected it with his own obsessions and with his own prejudices. So these 19th century translations, which I think even for people today are often people's introduction to the Nights, are very unreliable translations. They're interesting stylistically and historically, but I feel they give a very misleading account of what these stories are like in Arabic. For one thing, the style in Arabic, it would be easy to imagine reading the 19th century translations that Arabic was a language that was complicated, ornate, strange. In fact, it's very simple and compressed, a bit like English. Arabic is wonderfully precise and swift. And I think these 19th century translations gave this sense of a mysterious Arab world where things are much more complicated than they seem. And in fact, when you read the Arabic, it's pretty earthy and simple. So I wanted to give a sense of that, that simplicity and that swiftness. As I say, these were stories for merchants. They were not, the prose is not very highly wrought.
Good. I'll give you an example. It's one of the reviewers of translation, Yasmine's translation, mentioned that it's a pacey translation. And if you compared with Richard Burton's translation, this is the appearance of the genie. This is Richard Burton now, his, magniloquence. But presently there came forth from the jar a smoke which spired heavenwards into ether, whereat he again marveled with mighty marvel, and which trailed along earth's surface, till presently, having reached its full height, the thick vapor condensed and became an ifrit, huge of bulk, whose crest touched the clouds while his feet were on the ground. Okay, this is Richard Burton. And now we are talking Yasmine's excellent translation. Soon a thick column of smoke came from the jar, rose and spread over the earth and swelled until it carpeted the sea and reached the sky and dimmed the day. Then the smoke gathered and swirled and turned into a genie, feet on the earth and head in the clouds. Simple, economy, decluttering, and that's really the great mark of Yasmine's translation. Yasmine, maybe you would like to read some excerpt from any from Aladdin or from other stories.
I thought I would read you a love poem.
Okay.
The Nights combines poetry and prose, and also a genre in between, which is poetic prose, which is one of the lovely features of classical Arabic. There are moments when the prose breaks into a more musical, more rhythmic register, particularly to describe beauty or at moments of emotional climax. So although the language is simple, it's a very textured language on the level of style and rhythm. I wanted to read one poem. The Nights is studded with short poems that are mostly from the Abbasid period. So these are poems by real poets whose work is otherwise lost to us, but have survived by being embedded in this work. And I need you to unlock this.
Yeah, no problem.
Open sesame. The poems often appear to linger on a moment of crisis or to draw out the significance of an event. Many translators leave them out because they believe that these poems interrupt the flow of the narrative, but I think they're really integral to the work and to the distinctive nature of the work. So I've left them in, and this was one of the things I most enjoyed in this work, was doing the poems. This is a love song sung by one of the women in one of my favorite cycles of stories is the Porter and the Three Women of Baghdad. It's a wonderful, mysterious story about three women who live alone without a man. And this fact prompts a a problem in the story that is then resolved. And one woman at one point brings out an instrument and begins to play and sing. You are what I crave and desire, your company, eternal sun, your absence, fire. You are my whole life's craze, the one thing in my mind. Love is no crime. The shirt of pain I wore laid bare the grief within. My wet cheeks aired the love I hid. Secrets undone by telltale sobs. Cure me of this hard agony. You are its cause and remedy. Your healing hand inflames the hurt. Your bright eyes are the gold I hoard. Your rosy cheeks, assassins. Your hair is my jail. The game is up. A martyrdom of love is mine. Death by sweet swords. How many fine souls meet the same sharp, tender blade? I will not stop loving nor seek relief. Love is my law, my drug, inside and out. Happy the eyes that looked at you and one a look returned. Now I am burning, lost.
Wonderful. Arabian Nights have number of poems. I think according to some calculation there may be 1,400 poems, but most of the translators did not translate poetry. But Yasmine's translation is she has done dozens of those translations. And one of the poems which I came across, and I will just read a few lines from that. This is a person on the edge of despair. Do you not see that storms attack only the highest trees? Each earth has many places dry and green, but only those with fruit have stones to fear. And in the sky are many stars, but none suffer eclipses like the moon and sun. You thought well of the days when they were good, and did not care what fortune had in store. The nights were still and tricked you into ease, yet in the calmest nights does trouble come. So this is really despair of a man. It's really wonderfully, wonderfully translated. And I know poetry is so difficult to translate. I remember when we were in high school, sometimes we tried to translate poetry, Urdu poetry, into English, And I remember Ghalib's sher, famous sher, थी खबर गरम के गालिब के उड़ेंगे पुर्जे, देखने हम भी गए पे तमाशा ना हुआ. The news was hot that spare parts of Ghalib would be blown up. We went to see, but the spectacle was not held. So you can imagine, I was just telling them about it, sher, Ghalib sher. So it requires a lot of work to translate poetry. But since Yasmine is also a poet, she has that sensibility and the ear of a poet to be able to translate that very well. Okay, Yasmine, now we come to, I think in one of those, a letter which you wrote to your editor, Paolo, when you were translating Aladdin, you mentioned something like this, that Galland's text, when you translation from French into English, Galland's text moves at an elegant, almost stately pace. But I kept, that is Yasmine, I kept thinking about what it would sound like if we were to hear Shahrazad herself. She's quite literally telling her story to save her life. I kept imagining a kind of manic energy running beneath Galland's decorous prose. It is a symphony to be played prestissimo. How do you play it prestissimo?
To answer your question, I wanted to read the description of Shahrazad in the frame tale. It's very striking. Shahrazad only exists in a couple of lines. She is a character who exists entirely through the stories she tells, but when we first encounter her, she's barely described. We know nothing about her physically. Galland feels the need to add that she was a perfect beauty, but this is not in the Arabic. In Arabic, we only know about her internal qualities. We know what she has read and remembered. We know that she has read many books and memorized many stories and knows history and poetry. And there's a line that she was practiced at clear thinking and full feeling and close reading. So Shahrazad, in some ways, is less a character than a kind of library. She's a sort of concept or a principle of creation. And the Nights embodies, I think, an idea of literature which is not to do with producing original content, but is rather to do with remembering and recombining what you have read to make new stories. And this is also the whole history of the Nights. It's a work that has channeled previous stories and previous literary traditions and breathed new life into them. And paradoxically, by changing them, by constantly adapting them, has preserved them. So I wanted, as that quote makes clear, I wanted to give a sense of Shahrazad. Even though the conceit is fictional, she's obviously a fictional character, I wanted to at least take seriously the conceit that this is a performance, that this woman is telling stories to save her own life, that each night is a kind of marathon, a feat of physical endurance, a feat of breath work. So the prose in the English tries to capture something that I found in Arabic, which is an almost breathless quality. So the sentences are long and they're not broken up into little paragraphs. It's like a flow of speech, which is interrupted by the rising sun, which then becomes the kind of punctuation mark, the full stop at the end of every night.
Good. What are some of your favorite stories which you would recommend everyone to read, at least, if not the whole number of stories, but maybe a few stories?
I'm very fond of the cycle of Sinbad, which I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It's a story about failure and repetition. Sinbad goes on 7 voyages. It's a story about someone making the same mistakes again and again. Each voyage begins with Sinbad at home, at leisure. He wants for nothing. He's happy, and yet he's restless. And he goes out in search of danger and nearly dies each time and is miraculously saved, comes home, and does it all again. So these are stories about why we want things that are not good for us, which I think is one of the great philosophical problems. And it's also a wonderfully forgiving story, because it, I think, says that you can mess up again and again, and you will still be forgiven, and you can still have another chance. What's also fascinating about the Sinbad stories is that they incorporate real accounts of real places by Arab geographers, accounts of places like the Indian Ocean, and mixes that with fantasy, so that work is a kind of collage of the real and the fantastical, which I think is characteristic of the Nights as a whole.
Now, the Nights had a tremendous influence on a number of writers over the past 3 centuries. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are some of the elements which appeal to different writers to incorporate not necessarily themes, but some aspects of the Nights in their writings.
I mentioned earlier that the Nights has been in perpetual flux. It's a work that has never stopped changing. And I think that fluid quality has appealed to writers. It's almost an invitation to write the 1002nd night. And many have tried to write the 1002nd night, or to keep the chain going. It's a work that is somehow open. I was joking with my publishers that our book perhaps shouldn't have a back cover, that you should be able to keep adding to it. So I think that aspect has appealed to writers, and perhaps particularly to modern writers. It's a text that, although is very ancient, also has a kind of modern, almost postmodern quality, in that it's so unstable and lends itself so much to experiment and adventure. And as I said before, the story of Shahrazad is also a story about writing. The plight that awaits Shahrazad, the death of Shahrazad, is also the death of the writer. What does it mean to die as a writer? It's to no longer be read, to no longer be listened to. So this is the shadow that hangs over the storyteller.
Great. Okay, I think we have about 20 minutes, so let's have some questions. Yes, please. Give him the mic, please.
Hello. So I was interested in one thing that you said in between about
Please, could you
a
please
new.
stand up so that we can see you?
Is this not okay? Well, I can stand
Yeah.
up.
Okay,
It's
good.
required. So you said something about the nights being sort of a variation on like, an idea of literature, in that they recombine old narratives and instead of like forming new ones. I was wondering, just on just a theoretical basis, isn't all literature sort of just recombining language? Like, what would be literature that creates new content? Like, I was just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
I love that question. Thank you. For those who haven't heard, the question is, I described the Nights as modeling an idea of literature that's to do with recombining previous material rather than composing new content. And your question was, isn't all literature like that? And I tend to agree with you. I think all writing is in dialogue with previous writing. But there is an idea, there is a certain model of literature which is to do with the genius of a particular nation or of a particular language. And the Nights, I think, really resists that model. It belongs to no one tradition or to no one language, to no one nation. It has a really ambiguous status within Arabic, within the Arabic tradition. In some ways, it's more of a European text than it is an Arabic work, or at least it really can't be confined to the Arabic context. It's a work that's had an enormous influence on the rise of the European novel. It's almost an origin story for the French novel. Many of the great 19th century French novelists explicitly described what they were doing as writing The 1001 Nights for the West. So the Nights in turn became this kind of model of future literature.
Please, go. Get a mic. Here. The lady here first.
Hi. I wanted to ask that I've done a lot of research on my own into illustrated versions of the Nights, and I always find that it's more European artists like Walter Crane, Albert Letchford, all of them who have done like almost complete versions. So I was just hoping if there were any non-Eurocentric illustrators that you could tell me about that I could add to my research.
Thank you. There is a wonderful contemporary Iraqi artist called Diab Azawi. I can give it to you later. We included many of his works in the annotated edition that's just been published. He produced many prints, many illustrations of the Nights. And I really love his illustrations because they are not as illustrative as many of the European illustrations. They are more dreamlike and sometimes semi-abstract, which I think is more apt when it comes to these texts, because the texts are dreamlike. They are not quite, they can't quite be represented visually, I think. There are all kinds of logic gaps and continuity issues in the Nights, which I began to think of as being part of their dreamlike nature. These are stories that are told at night that take place where dreams should be, so they are not quite straightforward, or they don't quite belong to the waking, rational world. In fact, one way I came to think of the whole collection was that it was about the dark side of the mind. It's about irrationality. the whole frame story, the whole thing is triggered because a man is driven mad by his emotions. And the whole work is about whether it's possible to control that through language.
Good. There's a gentleman behind you first.
Would you like to tell us about the metaphors used in the 1000 Nights? To what extent these metaphors play a role for an impressive depiction?
I didn't quite understand. The metaphors in the Nights?
Yeah. You had told us that it's partly poetry and partly prose. And what about the metaphors used in these stories? And to what extent these metaphors play a role for an effective depiction or a perfect depiction of these stories?
There is a great deal of material life in the Nights. So we have glimpses through these fantastical stories. We have glimpses of the real life of the societies that produced these stories. And the metaphors are one way that material life emerges. People are often compared to fruits or flowers. I mentioned this register of poetic prose, which is often used to describe beautiful people. And that's a wonderfully poetic register. Which feels to me quite Persian, this tradition of comparing people to flowers or to plants. The cycle of stories I read a poem from earlier, the story of the porter, begins with a fantastic shopping expedition. It's a long market scene in which everything you could buy at the market in Baghdad is listed and described. So we get this fantastic sense of real life, edible life.
I think the gentleman there.
Working? Hello? Yes. My name is Muhammad Amir. Thank you for enlightening us on, about the back scene of these all the Alf Laylah wa-Laylah. My question is a little bit, which I'm trying to devise as well. When you mentioned about the Shahrazad story, and you said that there's a very little portion of what is described about Shahrazad. And then when you mentioned that Monsieur Galland, Antoine Galland, and the Diab, young Diabs, that Galland did not acknowledge a lot about what Diab has dictated or narrated to him. So when you were translating these things, were you being drifted towards creating a balance of the underprivileged character and trying to explain in your translation or uplifting the other one which was not being given a due, the credit? Or you just stuck with the originality, whatever the Galland has mentioned, and you just stuck with that translation? It's what you have analyzed. That's what I'm interested in.
I should say that I did not edit this book. I was commissioned, as I mentioned, by an editor who is a scholar of the Nights called Paolo Horta, and who had written a book called Marvelous Thieves, which is a book about the secret authors of the Nights. And there's a chapter on Galland and on Diab and on Galland's relationship with Diab. And it was on the back of that book that Norton, our publisher, commissioned a new edition of the Nights. So really the purpose of this new edition was to shine light on Diab, who for so long has been erased and forgotten. It's difficult to bring him to the fore in the translation itself, because all I have is Galland's text. But what we could do was provide context. So the edition is annotated, there are many notes, and there is also a long introduction. And I should mention that we also published a standalone edition of Aladdin, just the one story, because it's such a well-known story, but most people haven't actually read it. Most people's encounter with this story is through film or through theater, pantomimes. So we thought it would be interesting, in the light of what we now know about Diab, to give people the chance to reread it And that book also has an introduction explaining how it came into being.
Please.
Hi. I was curious to know if it felt daunting to take on such a well-known work of literature, and if it did, how you kind of overcame any barrier to inserting yourself into the history or the progression of these stories.
Of course it's daunting. I had very little background of expertise on this work when I had asked to translate it. In fact, I had read very little of it when I took on this work, which in some ways is a disadvantage because I didn't have the depth of knowledge that a scholar would have had. But I think it also gave me a fresh perspective on the stories because it meant that I didn't come to it heavy with theories about what was going on in this work. I think translation is really an act of listening, an act of deep listening. And when you know too much about a story or about a work or about the history of a work, that can become a kind of burden or a kind of veil that prevents you from actually seeing the text and hearing it afresh. When I try and translate, I always try and treat the text as a contemporary one, even when it's very ancient. I believe that every text is a contemporary one in the sense that it is a linguistic event happening at the moment that it's being read, and should produce that effect. It should have the feeling of something that is fresh and vivid, which is not to say that I tried to modernize it deliberately, but rather to capture the freshness that is already in the text. So I think being so new to it was also a kind of blessing because it allowed me to perhaps to hear new things in the text.
Any more questions? You wanted to ask something? Please.
I'm a doctor, I'm a mother and a grandmother. So I'm always been at storytelling to my children when they were young. He's my son, Dr. Sharo. So we were really interested to come here. And we chose this hall because I'm literally fond of listening to stories and telling them. But really it was a new thing for me that the origin is French. The origin of these stories is French. We never knew that. We always enjoyed reading these stories and telling our children. But the things I heard today are really new for me. And one time you said that there's still a controversy whether the origin is, the writer doesn't know exactly the origin, he's really inspired by the architecture of Syria or French. But the kind of persuasive, there's another point which leads to another positive about the origin is that he also has depicted the dressing as Arabian. So that's why the label is called Arabian Nights or something like that. The dressing of all the characters mostly is Arabian or like Middle Eastern. Is it so? It's not Western dressing of the characters, it is not Western. The dressing of the characters is all Arabian or Mid-Eastern. Is it so? This I want to know.
I didn't quite catch the end, but I love what you said about storytelling. And I should say, in response to your introduction of me as the first woman to translate these stories, that's true only in a very narrow sense of translation. Women have always been involved in the transmission of these stories. When I mention to people that I'm working on this text, they very often have a story about having been told these stories by a mother or a grandmother. In fact, women have been essential transmitters of these stories forever, and have also been among the most critical readers of the Nights, and have helped to give it new life along the way. Galland's publisher, and the person who really encouraged him to publish these translations was a widow in 18th century France, a very canny businesswoman. So the success is also hers.
Anyone else? Please.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you a question about the process of overwriting stories? Because this story, or these sets of stories in Arabian Night or 1001 Nights, have been overwritten by different generations, by different cultures, by different languages. On a general point, do you think all literature is actually about overwriting previously existing set of stories and symbols and metaphors jointly? But this is much more explicit. This seems to be a much more explicit version of maybe Southeast Asian story or South Asian story, set of stories overwritten by Persians, then by Arabs, then by French, then by others, so much. I'm just interested in that, and how much literature do you think is created transnationally and therefore has a universal feel to it rather than national feel to it? And that's probably what the force of literature is across the nations. Otherwise, people would be very limited in their view of what stories they read, what literature they read. But if Hamlet can have an impact on a Pakistani and vice versa, then there must be something in common in these stories which is shared across the nations. It's not a question, it's just maybe your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a huge subject and a really fascinating one. And maybe we could continue talking more informally. There are literary traditions that translate more than others, and I think translation has always been the way that literature has revitalized itself. A literary tradition that doesn't translate often ends up telling its own stories back to itself or looking in the mirror. And there are some traditions that don't translate. Chinese classical poetry, Chinese classical literary tradition translated very little. And there are other contexts where, the sonnet in English, if you think of the development of the sonnet in Italy, which came into English, and the rise of Renaissance literature, there was an enormous movement of translation that fueled the rise of this new poetic form. But your question is a whole book, I think. I need to keep thinking about that. Thank you.
Wonderful. I just remind you, so Yasmine's books, Aladdin and New Translation, and then the annotated Arabian Nights and Agitated Air. All these books are actually available from Amazon, also in Kindle and Apple Books. So if you would like to have to take them, you are very welcome to do it because they're really wonderfully done. So finally, I think we are perfectly on time. Thank you very much. I'm really happy that this was a very active participation. And finally, of course, I would like to thank once more Yasmine, who's done, as always, a wonderful job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shafiq.
Thank you very much. And if you would like to just have a chat with her, she's here for a few minutes.
We will be having our next session